So there's this pull in for equipping, push out for expansion. It's kind of the double move of the growth phase. You have to be able to equip others in that growth phase. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And you also have to be able to understand what it means to expand the ministry.
So could you tell us about the life stages of Jesus' ministry and what that teaches us about organizational life stages?
I sure can. Well, sometimes we have conversations that really change the direction of our life. And I had one of those when I was 23 years old and had been asked by a mission organization to start youth ministries on military bases in Europe, kind of a crazy assignment. And I was going to build a team and start this whole ministry and didn't really know what to do next. And was visiting a friend of a friend in Chicago. And he told me that he trained leaders, and he said he did it from the life of Christ. And I was spending the night with him, and I said, "Can you tell me more?" We ended up staying up until about 1:00. And what he did is he pulled out a really interesting Bible. It's kind of backwards, so I don't know if you can read it, but it's the Harmony of the Gospels, which basically takes the Gospels and puts them together in chronological order. It uses Luke, which was the gospel that was done. He said, "I'm going to give you the account in an orderly way." It uses that as the kind of the master chronology or the calendar, and then lines up all the other texts. You can see here's Mark and here's Luke. And so you can actually read the life of Christ as it unfolds chronologically, because, John focused on kind of themes. Matthew focused on the kind of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. But Luke said, "I'm going to give you an orderly account." So what if we follow that orderly account? And what he told me was, he said, what if we learn from Jesus, not just from his teaching, but from the way he built a movement, from the way he started really from nothing and left a multiplying movement behind in just 3.5 years. And I was super interested because I was going to start this ministry. And what he said is, he found 5 main phases in the ministry of the life of Christ. And what's interesting is they match. Now, you don't get the decline and the closure from that, but you get the upside of the graph. And basically it's divided like this. The first phase was preparation, which was the first 30 years of his life. So that's kind of the idea stage. You're getting your call, and then started the foundation phase, which would match in your area there to the startup phase. And what's interesting is I also have another very interesting piece that we use this when we're training leaders. It goes through all the events in chronological order. But here, if you would just look at the number of events, it's from here to here is that preparation time. It doesn't take too much of the Gospels. If you go from here to, there's not many events, to right about here, you can kind of see that. Actually, that's his foundation period, or you would call it the startup. And there's just a small number of events, but it takes 1.5 years. So we know that from the feasts and some of the other the holidays that we find in that text. And so we can see how he did his startup phase. And basically his startup phase started with his baptism, and then he went into the desert to be tempted for 40 years. And then you see kind of things unfold. He goes to a wedding, changes water to wine. He has a conversation with a Samaritan woman, has a conversation with Nicodemus. But then something, and that takes 1.5 years. There's actually only 2 recorded miracles in the first 1.5 years of Christ's ministry. One of them is the changing water to wine, and the second is the healing of the nobleman's son. But then 1.5 years into his ministry, you find a break point. You find it on my chronology here, where he calls his first 5 disciples. You remember he's walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he stops and he calls 2 brothers. He says, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." And then he goes a little bit farther, 2 others, and calls them, and I'll be fishers of men. And then a little bit later, he calls Matthew. So the first 5 disciples he calls to become fishers of men. And that marks the transition time from the startup to the growth phase, because what happens after that call is his entire ministry changes. And if you follow in the events, if I was to read them right here, or if I was to read them out of this book, you'd find that all of a sudden there's 2 things that happens. One is he pulls these disciples very close to him. and begins to equip them. And the second, he begins to push out an expansion. So there's this pull in for equipping, push out for expansion. It's kind of the double move of the growth phase. You have to be able to equip others in that growth phase. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And you also have to be able to understand what it means to expand the ministry. And so what you find in Jesus' life is he begins to do lots of miracles. And so only 2 miracles in a year and a half, and then all of a sudden miracles start. There's a number of them. He begins teaching larger crowds. And you see this, he teaches, and then he goes and talks to his disciples and explains things to them, or he gives them specific responsibilities. And that as that continues, the ministry really grows. Now, there's another spot that marks the transition to the mature phase, or what we call the multiplication phase. And that's when he appoints 12 as apostles and then sends them, and they minister without him. And so you see actually the ministry multiplying. That's when it reaches that mature phase. But we're talking about that growth phase, which would be between Jesus, when Jesus called his first 5, and when he sent the 12. What happened in that time that took the ministry from a startup to something that was multiplying and multiplying leaders? So that's just a little bit, Nina, kind of the theological background. And actually, he told me that when I was 23, I built my first ministry based on those principles. When I moved to Central and Eastern Europe and started Josiah Venture, I also said, how can I follow the phases of Christ's ministry and how I build an organization? And then it was only later that I studied organizational theory and found out that people who study from a totally secular standpoint actually mapped out the exact same phases. Now, they also mapped out decline and closure, which we want to say. And actually, there's something interesting in the maturity phase, which are loops of regeneration that keep you in that maturity phase. You don't just stay there. There's these loops of regeneration that hold you in the mature spot. But that's probably for another conversation, isn't it? Because we're talking about the growth phase right now. So we can come back. So Nina, what else would you be interested in me digging into?
Fantastic, Dave. Yeah, it would be interesting to go into the mature phase. Also, a really important conversation, but we want to zoom into growth.
That's right.
Dave, you've mentioned that in our preparation session, you mentioned that Jesus' leadership style actually shifted when he entered the growth stage. And I thought that sounds firstly very important for us to learn from, and so interesting. Could you tell us more about how he changed the way that he led when he hit the growth stage of his ministry?
One of the things to understand is just in the transitions in every one of these phases involves what we call a leader shift. It's something that the leader has to change what they're doing. What's difficult about those shifts is you have to change something that worked. There's a certain leadership style in a phase that's appropriate and most productive, but then that leadership style stops working and actually becomes counterproductive. And so one of the hardest things for a leader is to change a style that has been working, but then stops working because you're moving into another phase. So sometimes you can think of it like a car. When you start with a car, you want to start in 3rd gear. You don't want to start in 4th gear. You start in 1st gear. And then you move up, and there's a certain spot where you can be pressing on the gas, but you won't accelerate anymore. You reach the limit of that particular gear, and you'll see some signs. The car will start to shake. The engine will start to whine. Hey, increased effort on the pedal doesn't give you any more speed. And what you have to do at that point is recognize, oh, I need to shift gears. And you put in the clutch. You kind of disengage. Move to a new gear and re-engage your energy in a new way. And then you have a period of growth that takes you up to the next gear. And these stage transitions are like shifting gears in a car. They're like applying your energy in a different way and through a different gear set that actually allows you to accelerate through the next phase. And one of the things that leaders do is they don't make those gear shifts. The gear shifts are a little threatening. They're hard. They're a little scary, and because of that, they just kind of whine the engine or press hard on it or accept the certain speed that the car is going as kind of the top speed of the car when it really isn't. So maybe the question is, what's the shift from startup into growth phase? So I can mention something about that. Well, in startup, you're successful because you're able to you're really able to do everything. and willing to. So startup phase is very much a jack of all trades. So you know, let's say you start a new church. Well, you're going to unlock it. You're probably going to clean afterwards. You might prepare the refreshments. Sometimes you're the one leading the worship, and then you get up and preach the sermon. And you pretty much have to do everything and be willing to do everything. If you're starting an organization, well, you're doing the books and you're laying out the material and actually, one of the reasons why a startup works is because the leader is willing to do that, willing to do everything, willing to switch. And what you find in Jesus's first phase of ministry is he spent a lot of time in homes. He's talking with Nicodemus, talking with the Samaritan woman. He's changing water to wine. There's a lot of purposeful wandering around. And you pretty much see Jesus doing everything. What happens in the next phase is he begins to equip others and work through a team. And the working through a team then allows him to push expansion. So that's that equipping expansion move. But that involves a change. He has to spend his time differently. And so time that he was spending, he was doing everything. Now he's spending with his disciples, giving them insight into why he's doing it and what he's doing. Much more intensive time with his team. And also when he's working out, he's working in different ways. So we can talk about a few of those things, but it really is if you look at his life, that point of calling the first disciples, it's a massive shift in the way he leads and the way he applies his energy.
Fascinating. Dave, you mentioned that there were some signs. Yeah. You mentioned that you'll see, with a gear shift, you'll hear some sounds, you'll feel some vibrations. What are some of those signs that a leader on this call might be missing, or that actually indicates they're moving from the startup phase into the growth phase?
Yeah. Well, things that work stop working. Things just start shaking. You start hearing noise. I don't know how to describe that, but maybe I'll give an example. When we started Josiah Venture in Central and Eastern Europe, we started with 2 couples, and then a third one joined us. And we would have team meetings, and we would sit in a circle, and everyone would share. Everyone, how are you doing this week? Well, how are you going? What's going on? And then we would go to plan something, and we would all plan it together, and everyone was involved in everything. And everyone did everything. Well, then we grew to 10, then we grew to 15, then we're somewhere around 17 and 18. And what started happening is we'd sit in a circle, and if everyone talked, we were there for 3 hours instead of for one, and we weren't getting to our work. When we went to plan, because there were so many voices in it, either a few people dominated and others were quiet, and no one knew what to do. Well, there's 16 people in the room. What am I supposed to do? And so you'd find people leaning back. Some people were leaning forward and dominating. Some people were leaning back and doing nothing. And then they're kind of complaining, I don't have a place, or how come they're talking so much? And you just get this kind of shaking. You realize it stops working. Can we still sit in a circle? Can everyone still talk? Can it just be that everyone does everything and it stops working? That's one of the signs. And then the other thing is back to that acceleration. You try to push to do a little bit more, and you can't. I found as a leader that my day was absolutely full. I couldn't find any more time to do anything more. My to-do list was way too long. And what it felt like is there's no way that I could do more or we could grow more. Now, what's so interesting was I felt that when we were about 18, and now we have 375 on our staff. At 18 or 20, I felt like, oh, I can't do anything more. And what you find is there are gear shifts that allow you to apply your energy in different ways and basically really increase the capacity. So those would be things to think about. Now, if you think about Jesus, actually, I'm going on to another question. So Nina, your question you asked was about what are the signs? So what else would you like to know?
I'm as excited as you to get to all of the other stuff to cover. I do think there might be more signs that some of the leaders on the call might be experiencing that I would love to unpack, and maybe we just unlock that together. So you've spoken about like the example of the circle and the essentially the method in which you met as a team. That's one thing where one would see, and the
Your
other
method
thing,
stopped working. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, your own leadership capacity, the fuel, you put on
Yeah.
more fuel. Are there other signs? So say, for example, a team or an organization choose to remain a small team so they don't grow, but still the organization itself reaches, goes out of startup into growth stage. What are any other indicators that might show a leader they are actually not in the startup phase anymore and they need to make a shift?
Yeah. One of the biggest thing is you start. Well, let me back up. One of the things that you do in the startup phase is you're figuring out what works, and so you're trying lots of things, and you try this and you try that, and you talk to these people and you talk to those people, and somewhere along the line, some things begin to work, and so and in the growth phase, what you're trying to do is trying to multiply those things that work. So it's like in the startup phase, you're trying to figure out your recipes, but in the growth phase, figure out what works, let's say. In the growth phase, you're trying to create recipes for those things that work. Because often what happens is that you learn how to do it, but you learn very intuitively how to do it. Let's say you learn how to, what would be an example? So let me give you an example. You're starting a restaurant. Now, we're not talking about ministry now, but let's say you're starting a restaurant and you try this and you try that and you find out that your homemade ice cream is actually the thing that's doing the very best. But you made that ice cream with your mom when you were young. You just know how to do it. And then you ask somebody else to do the ice cream. It doesn't turn out the same way. It just doesn't turn out the same way. So you pull back and you think, well, I have to do the ice cream all the time because they just don't do it like I do. And actually, when I give it to them, the quality goes down and our guests are real unhappy. And so I guess either I have to do it, which means that we're only going to serve, 20 liters of ice cream a day, or we're going to be 50 liters, but the quality is going to go way down. And what happens in the growth phase is you have to take what works and turn it into recipes. And so you have to take the knowledge that you have and then describe it and record it in such a way. So I'm a horrible cook, but I can read. And so if I have good instructions with maybe some pictures, and so if someone would show it to me once and then give me a recipe that I could follow and then help me get the equipment, I probably could cook, even though I'm a terrible cook, because you've just given me a good recipe. And what happens in the growth stage is you have to actually take what works and turn it into recipes, and then equip others to do the things that you were able to do before. And so that's actually, we're getting to some of the tasks of that growth phase. But one of the signs is you just find that, hey, I can do it, but no one else around me knows how. And I'm having a hard time getting good help because they just aren't. That probably means that you haven't pulled back and shifted energy into equipping. So one of the big gear shifts, leader shifts from startup into growth is the shift from doing to equipping. So, and if you'll notice that when Jesus moves into that, he starts spending about half his time equipping those early disciples. And as you look at it, you would go, well, all that time he spends equipping them, he's not doing it. He could get more done by doing it. But he teaches them, for instance, a little bit later on, you find that they're doing all the baptizing. He's not baptizing anyone. They're the ones that are doing it. And then you have feeding of the 5,000, where they say, Jesus, everyone's hungry. And he says, you feed them. Well, we don't know what to do. And there's this whole long interchange. He could have done it so much faster by himself. But what he's doing is he's equipping them. He's using the work to equip his team. But that takes a shift. The leader's got to be willing to spend, to pull off energy from doing and channel it into equipping. And initially things slow down, but then they speed up. And that dip in speed is what a lot of people are not willing to go through. They want to keep the same speed. And what happens is they speed up and then they slow down. It's better to slow down into equipping and then you'll speed up afterwards. And those are some of the leader shifts that are hard to do as you enter that growth phase.
That's so good. I'm glad you mentioned about the speed, and that you started leaning towards the leader shifts. Dave, it sounds so hard to do that though. A leader going from startup to growth, you're used to doing everything yourself. And like you say, it's much faster to just do it yourself. Have you seen that leaders find it really challenging to make those shifts?
Yeah, they do, and often they don't make them because again, the initial feedback is that it feels like everything slows down and gets more complicated. And now, if you stay in it, what'll happen is it'll all speed up. That's back again to that illustration. You push in the clutch, and the car actually slows down, and there's this kind of pause. Nothing's happening. That's now it's quite fast in shifting a car, but it's longer. And then as you re-engage, it kind of goes until it picks up, you know. And so it's just and that dip is hard for leaders to go through unless they understand where they're headed. So I'll give you one. I actually met with two people this week that I'm coaching. One of them who's just coming out of the growth phase, and one of them who's just going into it. So I'll tell you some about my coaching of both of them. The one that's just going out of it went into that growth phase about 4 or 5 years ago. He is an unbelievable worker with like early teens, and had a youth ministry in his church that was about 70, the largest youth ministry in the country. And so he went, I want to get this youth ministry going in a bunch of churches rather than just in my own. So it went from that startup. The startup was his initial model that was working. Now he wants to grow it. And I said, his name is Daniel. I said, Daniel, the first thing you've got to do is you got to take all that intuition and experience and turn it into recipes. And then you have to try out your recipe and see if it works with someone else, and then back up and refine it and work on equipping someone, and then back up and figure out what went wrong, because it won't just go in a straight line. You have to learn how to equip other people to do what you want. So for a while, we would meet every month or two, and I would edit his recipes. Basically he would say, "Oh, this is how you do a really good preteen work," and I go, "Way too complicated, Daniel. I don't know. It makes sense to you because you're a pro at this, but I don't know what to do next. Simplify it. You got to make it simpler for me. Show me some pictures." And so we honed his recipes, and then I worked on him shifting the amount of time where he spent time, and he began spending. One of the things about equipping is it takes much more time than we think, and it feels like we're not doing anything. We're not getting anything done. We're just equipping someone. He began to shift his time into equipping, work on his recipes, work on developing his way of training and equipping other people. And what happened was, okay, now we're about 6 years later. He started youth ministries in 50 churches across the country, and has a team of 23, 7 full-time equivalents. He's done all that in 5 years. Fantastic growth that's happened. So what you see like Jesus with his ministry team of 12. Well, that's what Daniel has right now. He's got a group of people that are doing things with him. And then this expansion of ministry, that's what happened to Daniel. He accomplished both of those. And now we're really moving into that multiplication phase, that maturity phase, and talking about, there's another whole set of shifts involved in that I won't talk about now because we're in the growth phase. Now I'm working with him on that.
Fascinating. And you mentioned there was another example. So you've spoken about him who's
Yeah.
exiting the growth stage, and there's also an example of someone who's just entering the growth stage. Is that correct?
Yeah, his name is Paul, and I met with him on Friday. Paul just is finished a church plant that he really started from scratch. Churches are not big here in the Czech Republic, so he's grown it to about 25, which is good here. Things go slow here, and he's learned a lot. But part of how he's grown it that way is he just has he's learned how to do everything. He's taken whenever there's a hole, he jumps in it. And in fact, he told me on Friday, he says, what I learned is if I don't step into the middle of it and hold it, nothing happens. So he steps in the middle of things and holds it, takes final responsibility for everything, pushes it forward. And he's been able to accomplish a lot. Now he's been called to a church of 200, and he's just getting ready to move into that spot. He's going to have to totally change his leadership style. And so on Friday when we were talking, he said, I see some big needs in this church. We need a children's ministry. And not only that, we're going to have to start renovating the building. And I think I'm going to have to take first responsibility on both of those projects. And I said, Paul, no. What you're doing is you're jumping into the middle of the biggest problem and holding it yourself. And what you have to learn is to spend your energy kind of defining the space, finding the person and equipping them and supporting them to do it, not doing it yourself, which will take a little bit longer, but will keep you, otherwise you're going to become the bottleneck and this whole church is going to slow down behind you because you'll be the slow spot in the church. So so basically what I told him is I said, Paul, you have 4 main responsibilities. One is to chart the direction. You got to chart the direction. Also, he's got to teach the word. But the second is he's got to divide the work. And this is one of the things you do in the growth phase is into pieces and then entrust them to various people and equip them to do that. So I said, you've got to take the list of all the things that need to be done. And instead of you just jumping into it and saying, I'm going to do those 20 things and get people to help me, you've got to say, what are the natural divisions to all those pieces? So instead of it just being a mess of tasks, how can we divide those into distinct areas of responsibility and then equip and entrust people to carry those? And then he keeps the whole picture, but then really supports and trains those people. And I said, that's the work of leadership that no one else can do. And if you're busy being the point person for the children's ministry that's getting started, you won't do the work of leadership that actually creates a context for everyone else to serve in. So that's another one of the tasks of recipes is a big task of the growth phase. Equipping is a big task for the growth phase, but also taking what seems to be just a mess of tasks and dividing them into distinct areas of responsibility, and then finding people who are gifted in those areas and entrusting those to them. So that's one of the key. As you build your team, it goes from you're the generalist that does everything, and then you gather around you 2 or 3 other generalists, and you all do everything, to where you start saying, who's really good at what, and how do I take this pie and put it into pieces and entrust different pieces to different people?
So good. So those are a few of the important priorities that we'll unpack even more. Let's close the conversation around leadership shifts. You've mentioned the important shift of going from doing to equipping. Let's unpack just the final bit. Are there any other leadership shifts that's important for a leader to make as they go from start up to growth, and then we're going to head into the challenges?
The 2 moves in the growth phase are, one, you pull people close and equip them, and then you push out an expansion. So you won't grow if you don't build the ability to expand. Some people take a pie and divide it up into pieces, build a team, and then you get to the end, you find out that actually about the same amount of work is being done. It's just being done with everybody a lot more relaxed and organized, but it hasn't really grown. So in the growth phase, you do want to grow. So one of the things that Jesus did is, well, he started doing lots of miracles. He started doing very large public preaching. He actually started really ministering to people's felt needs. There were a lot of sick people, a lot of people that were they were demon possessed, different things like that, and he was responding to people's felt needs in a way that really created a magnet around him. And so one of the things in the growth phase is we have to figure out, of the 20 things we can do, what's the small list that are bringing the most fruit? And then how can we actually push expansion in those areas? So one of the things that happens, like when a bush grows, and I've got an illustration for our vineyard I can bring in a little bit later on, which I told you about, Nina. When a bush grows, it grows in all these different directions, or even a tree. And what you have to do is you have to choose, hey, these branches have the most potential. And you actually have to prune. You have to come back from all the different things you were trying to say, what are the most fruitful branches? And then how can I expand those? And so you find in Jesus's ministry, his teaching was extremely fruitful. his miracles were very, very, very fruitful, but also the way he was actually ministering to. There were a lot of downtrodden. There were people who were in great need, and his Nazareth proclamation, where he talks about to bring sight to the blind and freedom to the oppressed. Well, if you're an oppressed and you hear that, you go, hey, talk to me. To proclaim the Lord's favor. So he's actually declaring kind of the key things he wants to bring to the crowds of people, and then as he begins to bring those things in really significant ways, then people begin to respond. So just to give you an example, we tried all kinds of different things with youth ministry here, and we found, actually crazy, but English camps worked. And so we began to prune back other things and go, let's do a bunch of, this is working. Instead of doing 7 of these, let's do 12, let's do 15, and maybe cut down some other things we're doing, but multiply that which is working and figure out how to systematize it and do more of them. So we went from 3 camps to 7 camps to 15 camps. This year we'll do 120 of those camps. And we've been doing it for 32 years, and they just bring a lot of fruit. And so part of what you do in the growth phase is you try to figure out what's bringing the most fruit and how can we prune the other branches and do more of that thing that is really meeting people's needs and God is really blessing.
That's such a powerful analogy, Dave. I can imagine it's really tough for leaders coming out of the startup phase. You're used to maximizing every opportunity, every branch that grows. You want to.
You don't want to cut anything off.
Any sense to cut it off? It feels ridiculous to do that, but yet it's so important. Perhaps tell us more about what happens if you don't prune the vineyard. In an organization, what happens?
Yeah, in an organization. Well, one thing, you start going every different direction. But it's interesting. My brother just started a vineyard on some family land back in the United States in Portland, and it's been very interesting to watch the whole process. So the first thing they do is they plant these these seedlings or whatever. But actually the startup phase was before that, because someone had to plant them as seeds and grow them. So when we plant them in our vineyard, we're actually hitting the growth phase. So we plant them in there, and then the first several years they prune them back to almost nothing, because there's a couple of things that have to happen. One is they have to force the roots, and a vine will quickly outgrow its roots. It'll put on more foliage, more branches than it can sustain. And so you actually have to prune the branches. One of the reasons to prune the branches is to force the roots, because if you don't force the roots, you'll down the road, often the plants will die, or they'll overextend themselves and not bear any fruit, or the fruit will be really small and not very tasty because they just haven't developed their roots. So you force the roots, but then you come back and actually you prune it to just 2 buds, 2 branches, and the 2 branches go out like this, and then everything comes up from those 2 branches, and the vine just pushes all their energy into those 2 spots and really pushes it out, and then you have some fruit that's worth something. If you leave everything, what happens is you have branches that go everywhere, and the energy of the plant, which is not very strong yet. That's the thing. There's not a lot of energy in the plant yet. The energy of the plant gets diffused, and the fruit is not very large. So the vine dresser has to work against what the vine wants to naturally do. The vine wants to naturally produce lots of branches and not do roots. And the vine dresser has to say, no, I'm looking forward to the future. And I know to get the best crop out of the things, we're going to have to focus. We're going to have to push the roots, and until we grow to the place where we can actually, and then it can sustain much more. And you can then, because the roots are strong and the trunk is strong and all that, then you can move into that mature phase where you can sustain more branches. But I would say in the growth phase, it's very important to focus. And often now in the mature stage, you have more margin for trying different things, more energy for experimentations that go off. But in the growth stage, it's really around what are the few things that are bringing the most fruit, and how do we give as much energy to that as possible, because that will pull everything forward, and just kind of creates that updraft in the fire that then will allow us even in the future to be able to maybe handle some wet wood a little bit later
Yeah.
on.
So, Dave, what does it mean to force the roots in an organization? Like, what practically for a leader, what does force
Mm-hmm.
the roots mean?
Well, one thing would be spending time in equipping. So Jesus is out; he does 4 miracles, and then he goes off to the side, and he pulls with his disciples into the wilderness, and they sit there and talk about the whole thing. Well, he's forcing the roots. He's forcing the roots in them. He's forcing the roots in their development. So actually, they pull off of activity to be equipped and to go deeper. That's one of the ways. But there also is infrastructure that forms roots. So we just had a ministry that outgrew its roots, and we're having to cut it back to almost nothing. But part of it was the leader was impatient, and what he didn't do is he didn't spend time. He didn't have a good financial system. He outgrew his financial system. He never got a financial system in place. His financial system was a big one account that all the money came into and all the money went out of, which worked okay when it was just him. But then it started breaking down. He started having lots of financial problems because he didn't know where anything was. Well, Roots would have been spending time building that financial system. Another thing he did was he didn't spend enough time in fundraising and building his financial base. And what happened? They were continually running a deficit because he overextended his finances, and he wouldn't back off and work on building a team. He just would push. And then what happened is it just got weaker and weaker, and then it fell back. And then the other thing he did is he didn't do the organizational work to divide up responsibilities in the team. And so really everything tied back to him. If you had any question, you ask him and he has the answer. If you want to know what to do, ask him and he has the answer. But nothing was delegated. Responsibilities were not delegated to other people. Everyone else were just helpers. And he was the source of all answers. So even when it came to, hey, can we buy this? Or can we do this? Everything was just what this leader decided. And so then his team starts to get burned out, and they start getting frustrated, and the entire team fell apart. We're having to strip it back to almost nothing because it got unhealthy. It got overextended. Well, he was impatient. He wouldn't push his roots. He wanted the branches. And if he would have pushed his roots several years down the road, he'd be quite a ways ahead of where he is today. Now, that's where you have to sometimes slow down to speed up. But leaders get impatient. They want to see a lot of green as quick as possible, and they don't build a base that can sustain for the future.
Yeah. So, Dave, I have a question that links to this. Chris is asking, how important is the timing of the pruning? And asking about too early pruning could limit or stunt growth. So how does leaders know when and what to prune?
Well, what's interesting in the startup phase, you really try everything. You let a lot of things grow. And this is interesting. Even with Jesus, you see him purposely wandering around. He's hanging around John as he's baptizing, and he's having a conversation in a Samaritan town. Well, does that mean he's going to start a ministry in a Samaritan town? No, he just has a conversation there. So there's all these things that grow. He decides not to go to Jerusalem for the festival, but he turns water to wine. Then he moves to Capernaum from Nazareth because he gets rejected there. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It feels like all this random stuff that's going on. And so in the beginning, you do if you prune too soon, you don't get enough. Actually, if you don't prune later, you don't get strength. If you prune too soon, you don't have strength either because you don't know what's going to work. So you try a lot of things, and it's not particularly efficient. And you're watering this, you're watering that. So I would say in the startup phase, there is a lot of experiments, a lot of different kinds of things. But I would say once things strengthen, you find what is producing fruit. And also his mature, he had enough relationships and enough momentum to be able to call people close to him. So when he went and called his first disciples, actually they came. Well, why was that? Well, some of those were the ones that he had his first conversation with him back outside of Jericho when he was baptizing, and he walked through John's disciples and then saw some people behind him, and they said, "Where do you live?" He said, "Come and see." They spent the day together. Actually, those are some of the same ones he calls when he calls the first five. But you see that he built enough relationship with them and enough strength in that relationship to when he says, "Hey, come, follow. I'm going to make you a fisher of men," that they responded. So that's part of this growth phase is you have to be able to pull people close around you and build a team. And so part of it is you need, if you start without a relational base and try to build a team, it's often very hard. You have to do that startup work that's much more messy. And then you can start pulling people close to you.
So how does that teach a leader? How can we pull a learning of like what's the best timing for pruning from that example? So I think the challenge for leaders is to not prune too soon and also not too late, exactly like you said. But how would they know when to prune?
One of the things is when you hit the growth phase, you just run into capacity problems. Everything's overextended. So maybe if I go back to the restaurant example, which is kind of crazy, I want to open a restaurant. I want people. So I cook some burgers and I do some ice cream and then I do some of this and then I sit around and I wait for a customer because no one's coming. And then I clean a little bit, or even in a church, you start up. There's not much going. What happens when you hit the growth phase is you run into capacity issues. Okay, there's 10 people who want ice cream and 10 people who want burgers, and we're out of tables, and then what happens is if I don't prune, I'm not going to be able to focus on the things that produce the most fruit. So part of it is sensing when you start running into those capacity problems where people are responding, the ministry is growing. I'm doing 4 things, I'm doing 5 things, and one of them is going really well. And let's start pruning the others and push the focus of it into that. So.
Okay.
So back to like our early years of ministry here. So everything happened in our house. That was one thing. And everything. And we had 3 youth groups going on and I was leading 2 of them, plus doing the training material, plus doing the books, plus, you just, and it got to a point where you just go, this is just chaos. And so what are we going to stop doing, and how am I even going to prune my energies to where maybe some things are being still done, but I trained someone to take over this group, and I figure out how to move everything out of our house because everything was in our house, and and you just start to get more space. You start to separate things out.
Okay, I hear that leaders really need to shift focus, and you'll sense capacity issues when you really need to start pruning. So let's give the leaders a practical list, something to walk away with if they are in the growth phase. What are the really important priorities that they do need to focus on? You have touched on some of them during the conversation, but I'm looking for like a summary of here is the list of things that you need to focus on as a leader in the growth stage.
Yeah. I would say 2 things: pull a few people close and equip them, and figure out how do you push out an expansion. So when you pull them close, you're going to have to spend more time. You're going to have to invest in them. You're going to have to figure out how to entrust various things. With the pushing out, that has to do with taking what's working and figuring out how to turn it into recipes and multiply it, and so that it can happen without your energy. So those are the 2 things that happen with, So I did the first 3 English camps, but then how do you figure out a recipe for an English camp so somebody else could do it? So I don't have to be there. And then how do I train them and and get those recipes. And then the second thing is you do really want to not neglect your roots that at that time. So there's things like, do we are we building the systems that will handle growth, because they take a little while to build. Do we are we accounting for money correctly? Are we handling are we caring for our people properly? Are we those kinds of things? And so you do have to pull back energy. And some people say work on the business instead of in the business, work on the ministry instead of in the ministry. So it's like you step back and you treat the whole ministry as your project, rather than your project is what the ministry is doing. The ministry is your project. You're building you're building a ministry, and not just, I don't know, if you work on the business instead of just in the business. And so that takes a shift of thinking, kind of stepping outside of this. And how do I build something that actually works, and that works without me holding all the pieces and doing everything?
Right. Yes, and you mentioned that's the work of leadership, and that shift that
That's
needs to
right.
happen is and that's the work that only the leader can do. And so
That's
to
right. You
learn
can't
to
delegate that. Yeah. That's,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Dave, I've seen a few questions about also coming towards the end of the growth stage. So this would be, I think we'll be wrapping up here. Are there any clear defining lines between growth and maturity? So there might be leaders on this call who's in the growth stage, but they might actually be experiencing those vibrations. That means they're ending their growth stage. What are those defining lines? How do you know it's time to go from growth to maturity?
Actually, yeah. In maturity, we often use the word, it's that there's, in maturity you get multiplication. So in growth you get expansion. In maturity you get multiplication. That's the big difference in that particular phase. And also that in the growth phase, you're equipping workers. In the leadership phase, you're actually releasing leaders. Now, what's interesting was that they were the same people. So it's not like the workers became leaders, but in the growth phase, they were workers. And what happens in the leadership phase is, now in the growth phase, they're entrusted with responsibilities, but in the leadership phase, they actually carry. They're not just entrusted with responsibility for work; they're entrusted with leadership responsibility.
Right.
So that's a different kind of a weight. So when Jesus took they were, I come and I'm going to make you fishers of men. Well, now I'm going to make you an apostle. Well, that's different than just a fisher of men. A fisher of men is someone who does a certain activity. An apostle is someone who carries the weight of ministry, and they carry it,
Yeah.
primarily before God. And then what he did is he sent them, and they worked without him, and they were fine. So
Yeah.
they could. He didn't even have to be there. So part of it is when you get to that phase, also things start to shake again. And that has to do with how do you release leaders and actually take the ministry and again put it into pieces, but put into pieces that are actually entrusted to people who are leaders. So it would be a multiplication step. So for us, part of what happened was, we have a ministry in one country, and then it started expanding to two, and then to three, and then to four, and to five. Well, each of those, that has to have a leader, and then those leaders are working together. But really, what happens in that multiplication phase and that maturity phase is pieces of the ministry kind of function. They're able to function really on their own, and they're linked
Okay.
together with coordination between those leaders. But that person can handle it. They're doing fine. And then you reach a mature phase where things can really multiply. In
Mm.
in the in the growth phase, you're growing by addition. In the mature phase, you're growing by multiplication, and that's a whole different kind of. And we that will need to be another session to talk about
I was
the
just about to
leader
say, Dave,
the
it's
leaderships that are involved, because those are hard ones too. And
yes. Yeah, and it was great how you say how you distinguish the two of growth by addition and multiplication by what's the word?
right,
Sorry,
Yeah, but and
Expansion.
growth by multiplication. Yeah, but
Yes,
it's
exactly.
basically there's
So
an expansion and multiplication. There's a difference between expansion and multiplication. So
yeah.
so it might be yeah, yeah,
So tempting to go into that, but we will have to close.
yeah.
Unfortunately, Dave, thank you so
We're
much
just 3 minutes from the end. Yeah,
for your time and for all the examples. I trust that it's inspired leaders and really resonated to make those important leadership shift from doing to equipping and to really do the priority and the work of of equipping their team so that you can expand in the growth stage.